Well, good morning to everyone, and I'd like to ask everyone if they would please take their seats. And panel members can sit out in the general seating for the time being, and as soon as we turn to that part of the program, they can take seats here where their names are marked. I'd like to welcome everyone here this morning. We're going to have a conversation hosted by the Internet Innovation Alliance on the future of the educational broadcast service spectrum and ways that we can enhance its use for the benefit of our nation's students. My name is Rick Boucher. I'm a former member of Congress, and I'm currently the honorary chairman of the Internet Innovation Alliance. We're a nonprofit membership organization devoted to the expansion of broadband availability to underserved areas and the promotion of broadband adoption in areas where there is currently internet access. Various factors suggested to us that the time may be right for an incentive auction of the educational broadcast service spectrum, and that a forum to explore the issues that would be involved in conducting such an auction would be timely. Consider the following. A majority of today's teachers routinely make homework assignments with the expectation that students will go online in order to complete the work. But students don't have equal access to high-speed broadband, and it's frankly inequitable for some students to stay up late doing homework assignments simply because of a slow or in some cases no internet connection at home. An incentive auction carries the potential of yielding significant monies that the FCC could devote to innovative means of advancing educational opportunity for students who do not have adequate internet service at home. Popular and useful internet applications are going to require a lot more mobile spectrum. We're now seeing an onslaught of video streaming, wireless telehealth applications, and various other increasingly numerous ways that people are using mobile broadband. And of course, the oncoming era of 5G, which is going to provide for the Internet of Things, connecting a variety of different devices and facilitating, among other things, autonomous driving. Additional mobile spectrum is going to be necessary to facilitate all of these innovations. Many observers have suggested that since the educational broadcast service spectrum is currently leased by educational entity licensees to the greatest possible extent under current regulations to the mobile wireless carriers, an incentive auction could simultaneously compensate the educational entities and make much-needed spectrum available for mobile data uses. Current utilization of the educational broadcast service portion of the 2.5 GHz spectrum is inefficient, with limitations on the amount that can be leased to the mobile wireless carriers and residential white spaces occupying portions of the spectrum. Changes are needed in order to address these inefficiencies. We know that incentive auctions work. In the auction concluded in 2017, the FCC reallocated 84 megahertz of spectrum for wireless use and brought in $18.9 billion in auction receipts, of which more than $10 billion compensated broadcasters who surrendered spectrum for auction, and more than $7 billion went into the federal treasury. This morning, we hope to learn answers to a number of questions. Would an incentive auction carry benefits for the educational institutions that hold spectrum licenses and for the mobile wireless carriers that are currently lessees of the spectrum? Would an incentive auction be an appropriate way to honor the educational legacy of the educational broadcast service spectrum? Is there a better way to address the inefficiencies of the 2.5 gigahertz spectrum than submitting it to an incentive auction? Does the 2.5 gigahertz spectrum have characteristics that make it particularly appropriate or inappropriate for meeting the challenges presented by the coming 5G era? And what plans does the FCC have today for changes in the educational broadcast services spectrum? In order to answer these and other questions, we begin our program this morning with a conversation with FCC Commissioner Jessica Rosenworcel. Commissioner Rosenworcel is known as the author of the term homework gap that describes the circumstances associated with inadequate broadband access for many of our nation's students. She will share with us her thoughts about how disposition of the EBS spectrum can contribute to resolving the homework gap, and she will share her observations about the appropriateness of an incentive auction for the EBS. Later in the morning, we will be joined by a panel of knowledgeable professionals whose firsthand experience can offer valuable insights as decisions are made about the future of the 2.5 megahertz spectrum. Leading the panel discussion as moderator will be Fred Campbell, who is Director of Technology and an adjunct professor at the Nebraska College of Law. Fred formerly served as chief of the FCC's Wireless Bureau and as a wireless advisor to former FCC Chairman Kevin Martin. We invite all of our attendees, both those in the room today and those watching our live stream, to participate in the conversation, and our event address is at Auction EBS. That is at Auction EBS. It's now my pleasure to welcome Commissioner Jessica Rosenworcel. She and I are going to engage in a fireside chat. We thought about putting a video screen up and actually have some a photo of some fires burning, to sort of add to the ambiance, but we decided that it wouldn't add that much to the ambiance, and it probably would be more of a distraction. So we call it a fireside chat. It's going to be a conversation about what to do with the 2.5 gigahertz spectrum. So would you please welcome FCC Commissioner Jessica Rosenworcel. Well, Jessica, thank you so much for joining us here today.
Thank you for having me.
You very much honor us with your attendance. Let's start by talking about the homework gap. What is it, and what kinds of problems is it causing?
Sure. When I was growing up, if I wanted to do my homework, I needed three things. I needed paper, a pencil, and my brother leaving me alone. And it was that third one that was always the hardest part. But times have changed. Now there's data out there that say that 7 in 10 teachers assign homework that requires regular internet access. But the FCC's data consistently shows that 1 in 3 households do not have broadband. And where those numbers overlap is what I call the homework gap. And according to the Senate Joint Economic Committee, the homework gap is real. There are 12 million students in every state, all across the country, that fall into the homework gap and lack the internet access they need for nightly schoolwork. That's a problem. I think we need to address it.
Could an incentive auction of the EBS provide significant monies for addressing the homework gap and closing it, at least to some extent?
I think the answer is yes. I mean, we have a tremendous history of experimenting with spectrum policy in this country. We held the first auctions for spectrum and have raised billions of dollars by putting Ronald Coase's theories to use. We were the first to set aside swaths of spectrum for unlicensed, which became the Wi-Fi we use every day. And a few years ago, we held the world's first spectrum incentive auction, which raised billions of dollars both for public safety and the US Treasury. I think we should figure out how we can continue to be innovative and use those tools going forward.
So I gather from that answer that you think that the experience from that first auction that brought in a total of about $17 billion, subsequently divided between broadcasters and the federal government, serves as a useful precedent and suggests that the incentive auction mechanism works and that it would be appropriate for the EBS spectrum?
Absolutely. I think we proved with that effort that this tool works. Now the question is, where else can we put it to use and for what innovative purposes? I think the homework gap is a great place to start.
Okay. The EBS spectrum was set aside during the Kennedy administration to broaden education by getting television into schools. And I guess that was making optimum use of the communications medium of that time. Television is pretty much what we had.
Yeah, the history of this band is really something. I spent some time studying it, and I went back to Kennedy's speeches when he was running for president, and he spoke in these awesome terms about how technology and television was going to bring more education to more people in more places than anything that preceded it. And so many of his remarks parallel the ways we talk about internet technology today. But the striking thing is once he came into office, he appointed Newton Minow as FCC chairman, who is best known for his comment that television is a vast wasteland. But in 1963, it seems that Newton Minow had a change of heart, and he set aside this swath of spectrum in the 2.5 gigahertz band for what in grand bureaucratic language was called the Instructional Television Fixed Service. And he gave out licenses to educational institutions, some nonprofits that serve students, and basically said, go ahead, make television programming to serve educational purposes. It was a really grand idea, but it did not get off the ground because it turned out most of those schools, they were in the business of educating students and hiring teachers and filling their classrooms, and that providing television programming was really not in their DNA. So years later, in 2004, the FCC decided to revisit this. And we decided first and foremost, apparently, we should change the name. So we went from Instructional Television Fixed Service to Educational Broadband Service. And that, too, has some limited use. There are definitely some places around this country where schools have done some dynamic things, making broadband available to their students in Desert Sands, California, Albemarle County, Virginia. But most schools are not making use of this directly. They're just leasing it out or letting it lie fallow. And so the great promise of using the spectrum for educational purposes has really not lived up to its potential, and I think it's time to find a new way.
So how could we honor that educational legacy, which you've outlined thoroughly, by an incentive auction today of that spectrum? What are the benefits that would flow to education, and would those fully honor the legacy of this spectrum as being dedicated for educational use?
Yeah, I think the goal is to honor it in a modern way. And surveying these airwaves, what you realize is they're not fully put to use for educational purposes. So why don't we give those who hold those licenses a choice and say you can continue to hold them under the terms that we have had you hold them for some time, or you could choose to sell them back to the agency. And in return, we'll pay you for them, which is a benefit, of course, to nonprofits and educational institutions. And then we'll turn around and repackage all those licenses that are sold to us and sell them out for broadband use. And then the revenues from that can be used to fund homework gap initiatives in every state. I think that honors the legacy that the Kennedy administration worked so hard to set up, but it does it in a totally modern way.
You talked about homework gap initiatives perhaps arising at the state level. Will the FCC have a role in that? Do you contemplate some sort of model program that the FCC might put forward, or other kind of sponsorship the FCC might have of that initiative?
Yeah, you know, I've spent a lot of time traveling around the country talking to students and talking to school administrators. And what strikes me is we don't have all the answers here in Washington. But I have seen innovative programs in California and New Mexico where they put Wi-Fi on buses. And I've seen innovative programs in Pennsylvania and Virginia where they loan out Wi-Fi hotspots at every school. What if we could do those programs nationally and make sure those 12 million students get access to the internet access they need for homework? I think if we use the funds from this kind of auction to make that happen, we'd be able to solve the homework gap once and for all.
Would the incumbent educational licensees directly benefit from an incentive auction? And if so, would there be any limitations on how they could expend revenues they might receive from the auction?
You know, I think the most powerful thing about this is it gives them a choice. It's totally voluntary. And so they could choose to continue as they have service today, or they could sell it back to the agency for a lump sum and put them to good use for their educational institutions. I think that choice is a powerful thing, and we should find a way to make it happen.
And today, this spectrum is, the licenses are actually held by educational institutions, but history shows us that they have leased out that spectrum to the greatest possible extent the law allows to the commercial wireless carriers. So from the vantage point of a commercial wireless carrier, how would that carrier benefit from an incentive auction? Would it be a net loss for them, or is there some way in which they could benefit as well?
Oh, I think that's possible. I think the most important thing here is we've got this choice swath of spectrum. It is the largest contiguous swath of spectrum below 3 gigahertz. It's ideal for new 5G uses. So let's make the way that we distribute it across this country transparent. Right now, it's anything but. And were we to develop an incentive auction here, we could make these airwaves available on a more uniform basis to lots of carriers. I think that's a good thing.
So we began our conversation talking about the homework gap. Let's come back to that. Having established that an incentive auction would be a useful vehicle, precisely how would you go about closing the homework gap through the revenues to be derived from the auction? How would you do that?
Well, I think we'd have to take a survey and identify what programs are most effective in different parts of the country. Like I mentioned to you, in some rural areas where students ride on the bus for long periods of time, having Wi-Fi on a school bus is a game changer. And in some urban areas where students move a lot and don't have consistent access at home and library hours are being, reduced, having a Wi-Fi loaner hotspot from the school can make all the difference. So we're going to have to really work with schools and school administrators to identify what are the most effective and sustainable solutions for closing the homework gap, and make sure that we create programs to make that happen.
And so potentially loaning a mobile hotspot to students who do not have adequate access at home could be a cost-effective way in order to expend the revenues that are available in order to help close the gap.
Absolutely.
Okay. So let's suppose that an incentive auction does not happen. How would the FCC then go about trying to close the homework gap?
Well, this is difficult. In many respects, we have an E-rate program that is designed for educational purposes, but it's really centered on what can be done in school. And what's happened since the 1996 Telecom Act is passed is we've started to recognize that having access in school is not sufficient. You're going to need some form of home access to have a fair shot at success when it comes to your education. So we're going to have to figure out how to boost programs that already exist to make that happen. That includes Lifeline, that includes programs that carriers have today for low-priced and reduced cost service. But we're going to have to solve the homework gap. It is a big problem, not just for students, but for the communities themselves that have those students. We want to make sure everyone has digital skills in order to succeed. And this is a problem that's broader than just the students in the schools.
One of the major needs for new spectrum for wireless carriers is going to be for the deployment of the coming 5G era of wireless technology. Can you talk a little bit about the appropriateness of the 2.5 gigahertz spectrum for 5G?
Yeah, so now for the spectrum nerds, right? This spectrum is, like I said before, the widest swath under 3 gigahertz. It is internationally harmonized for commercial mobile use. It's being used right now in China and Japan for broadband mobile. And here's the thing, it's got the sweet spot. It's got the mix of coverage and capacity that is absolutely essential for making sure that 5G service reaches rural America. This is the spectrum that can make 5G happen in our rural communities because it doesn't require as many facilities as millimeter band spectrum does. So I think this is a really big piece of the puzzle for 5G, especially for our rural communities.
And are you referring to a fixed solution in rural areas
It
primarily?
could be possible, which could bring a whole new level of competition to some communities that don't have it. It could bring service to areas that lack it today. There is a lot of possibility and potential with 5G, with mid-band spectrum. And to be candid, the United States is behind. China's already set up mid-band spectrum. South Korea's already auctioned it, Italy, the United Kingdom, and Spain. The United States is behind on this swath of spectrum in the mid-band, and this is a great place to look to do something and make progress.
Could the proposed merger between Sprint and T-Mobile impact an incentive auction for the 2.5 gigahertz spectrum?
You know, so I don't run the show at the agency, but I have certainly asked to speak to our counterparts at the Department of Justice, see what they found about overlap in these markets, because the FCC has a spectrum screen, and we've seen some preliminary information, but we've asked for more, so we get a better understanding of who has access to the 2.5 gigahertz band nationally.
Let's talk a little bit about the role of Congress here. One of my favorite subjects.
Oh, you might know something about that.
So, you know, I know you as an FCC commissioner appear before Congress, and they're always suggesting to you, you should do this, you should do that. Let me turn the tables.
True.
Well, let's turn the tables a little bit here and give you the opportunity. What would you like to see Congress do? And so specifically, would Congress need to pass legislation in order to govern the flow of the distribution of the federal funds stemming from an incentive auction to make sure that they're directly targeted toward closing the homework gap? That would be one question. And another is whether the FCC would have a sufficient authority under current statutory law to conduct a 2.5 gigahertz incentive auction, or whether Congress would have to take some step to authorize that. So a little bit about the role of Congress.
All right. You're asking me to act above my pay grade, but I'll go right ahead. First of all, Congress makes new laws on spectrum policy. We're always happy to implement them at the FCC. But I do think there are different ways to do this. You could do it legislatively, whereby you could come up with very specific conditions associated with the incentive auction of these kind of airwaves, much as Congress did in the Middle Class Tax Relief and Job Creation Act of 2012 for broadcast spectrum. It could also be very specific about setting up a fund so that the revenues from the forward auction of these airwaves do not revert to Treasury as they would right now under Section 309 of the Act. However, I do think the agency can be creative. And I worked a lot on the legislation leading up to the broadcast incentive auction when I served as staff in Congress. And I know that there are other ways you can think about conditioning licenses in order to try to address problems like this and figure out how the funds can flow differently. So I do think there are ways the FCC could do this on their own, though we would welcome legislation from Congress on it. And then finally, you asked, do we have enough incentive auction authority? And I think the answer there is an unequivocal yes. The 2012 law gave the agency authority to hold incentive auctions. There was very specific authority related to the 600 megahertz band, but we absolutely have the authority to continue to use this tool, and I think we should.
Our friends in the audience, particularly those from the press, may have some questions they would like to ask of Commissioner Rosenworcel, and she's graciously agreed to entertain questions. So if you will raise your hand when you have a question, we have portable microphones here that can accommodate you. Any questions? Yes, ma'am, here.
Hello, thank you for your speech this morning. It's very informational. So I have a question on sort of, well, isn't the incentive auction a little bit of an extreme measure when there are other things that could be changed about the current rules, maybe changing? I know that the current proposal has suggested priority filing windows and other measures that could be taken other than the incentive auction. So how do you feel about sort of modernizing the rules in some other ways?
Absolutely, we should modernize them. But let's be frank about some of the language that's been used. The agency in that talks about flexible use, talks about getting rid of old lease restrictions. All of that would collapse the EBS system as we know it today. And so what I'm trying to offer is something that protects the good that it does today by making sure that anyone who's leasing and wants to continue leasing has the opportunity to do so. But they also have this other opportunity, which is to sell the license back to the agency. I'd just be careful to recognize that when we talk about flexible use and getting rid of old leasing restrictions, what we're really doing is talking about collapsing the existing educational regime in the 2.5 gigahertz band. And I think it's more important to develop a way to protect the good that exists today and give those licensees another option going forward that can multiply the good by setting up some funds for the homework app.
Thank you. I'm John Windhausen with the Schools, Health and Libraries Broadband Coalition. It is great to be in the presence of such two great leaders on these issues. And I really appreciate the ideas that you've raised, Commissioner. And you know, we love you because of your constant work to support the E-rate program in schools and libraries. If I could tease out a little bit more about the idea, though, to ask you a couple questions about those rural markets where there's no EBS licensee today.
Sure.
And it, you know, our incentive, the Shelby Coalition approach has been to support the idea that half of the country, there's no EBS licensee. You know, the licenses weren't awarded, so
it's
we
about
like
15% of the population, so geography by half, but population is between maybe 10 or 15%.
That's right, and we're trying to make sure that those, and as you are, trying to make sure that even that 10 or 15% in the rural areas gets the opportunity. And I think what's attractive to us about what the chairman initially proposed was to have these windows that would allow the schools and colleges and universities to be eligible to obtain these licenses in markets where there's no licensee today, and to speed that up to try to get those licenses out the door as quickly as possible. Could you address, because the incentive auction, as you've described it, it seems to apply to existing licensees, and might be some delay in that process that might make it longer to get the licenses out to the rural areas. So can you talk about that?
No, absolutely. It's important to point out that there are some licenses in inventory in the 2.5 gigahertz band. Some of them are, most of them are in rural areas or in areas that are sparsely populated. And what I'm talking about would be combining those with the licenses that are returned for a full incentive auction. But I think we have to be really frank. If you comb through the statements in the aftermath of that rulemaking, I don't see a lot about priority windows. I see a lot about getting rid of old lease restrictions and flexible use. And if we do those two things, the existing EBS system collapses. Because remember, the priority window system was developed before 1993 and the omnibus appropriations legislation that created auctions as the model. And so what I'm saying is that if we are looking at a world where we could collapse the system, the first thing I want to do is protect the good that exists today, and then try to expand it with an incentive auction and a revenue system for the homework gap going forward. So based on where I believe the agency is, I think that that's a viable way forward that provides a win for everyone.
So if I could just, wouldn't it help to protect the EBS system for the rural areas where there's no licensee, to give those preference to the schools to be able to acquire those licenses in those rural markets where there's no licensee today?
So it would be at odds with the auctions that we have held for spectrum since '94, and it would be inconsistent with where I believe my colleagues are. So I'm trying, in a world that's not perfect, to come up with a way to protect what we have and build some opportunities for the future. So that's why I'm trying to, find a different way forward. Because if we revert to a system that collapses EBS, I don't think there is really gain for anyone in education.
Other questions? Over here, Allison.
Howard Boucher, Communications Daily. Hey.
Hi.
I wanted to ask, you mentioned mid-band, and and there's been a lot of concern. You've raised concerns about whether the U.S. is keeping up with some
That's
of
true.
its international peers. What do you think, from what you can tell, what has been the effect of the shutdown so far in terms of, how much has it slowed work on these key mid-bands?
The answer is the shutdown is not helping. I suppose that's not news, but the truth is the agency is not putting out information about when our next auctions will be, particularly in mid-band. We're not tracking robocalls. We are not reviewing mergers. We are not addressing the sale of our mobile phone location data. We are not overseeing so many of the things that we do on a day-to-day basis. I think it's problematic, but for the long term, it's slowed down our work on spectrum policy, including mid-band, and I think that's a problem.
And last
Okay.
question,
Yeah.
right here. Yes.
Thank you. Hi, Kelsey Griffiths with Law 360. You mentioned that you've asked the DOJ for more information about the spectrum screen and how Sprint T-Mobile might affect that. Could you share any more information about the status of that question and what spectrum screen limits you're looking at?
No, just that certainly my office has made a request to learn a little bit more about the antitrust review and of this spectrum, among other issues. So we've only seen some preliminary information. We keep on asking for more information, and we'll continue to do so when the shutdown is over.
Thank you.
Well, Jessica, thank you so
Thank
much
you.
for taking part in this conversation
Thanks
today.
for having me.
And we've all learned a lot from your answers to all of the questions that have been posed. And I know everyone here appreciates your taking time to attend, particularly at a time when the agency is officially has its door closed.
Yeah,
So
I'm still working.
well, that's obvious, and we thank you very
Okay.
much. Let's thank Jessica Rosenworcel for joining us today. Thanks. Now I'm pleased to welcome our panel of knowledgeable professionals who will be talking about these issues during the second portion of our program. And the moderator of the panel, Fred Campbell. And I will mention that, as I indicated before, Fred is the Director of Technology. He's also an adjunct professor of law and former director of the Wireless Bureau at the FCC. Fred is going to offer his observations and then make an introduction of panel members and moderate the discussion from this point forward. Would you please welcome Fred Campbell?
So if we could just have the moderators come on up and flip your name cards around. Or panelists. If I said moderator, I meant panelists. So the panelists have a fuller bio that you can access on the IIA website. So I'm just going to do very brief introductions of name and titles, but each one of these panelists is very knowledgeable about this spectrum band, about wireless broadband and mobile generally, and take my word for it, I think we've got a good group here. So I'm just going to go right to left. We have Claude Aiken, who's president and CEO of the Wireless Internet Service Providers Association, also known as WISPA. We have Debbie Goldman, who is the Telecommunications Policy Director at the Communications Workers of America. We have Zach Leverins, who's founder and CEO of Everyone On. Catherine Messier, Director of Development at the North American Catholic Educational Programming Foundation. And last but not least, Peter Pitch, an Intel consultant who was also their former Associate General Counsel at Intel. So, really interesting conversation between the Congressman and Commissioner Rosenworcel. And I'd like to start off with a question that's sort of related to a question that was asked from the audience. And this question sort of gets at the question of what is the goal here when it comes to educational broadband service? And once you figure out what the goal is, how best to solve it? Because I think there may be some disconnect between what Commissioner Rosenworcel calls the homework gap and what the benefits of the educational broadband service have historically been, which was the question from the audience about, well, how can we preserve those benefits for rural America where there are currently no licensees? So historically, there was very little relationship between the broadband needs of particular educational institutions and the EBS licenses. In fact, there was none because it started out as a television service. So if you want to do educational television back then, there was only one way to do television. You had to have a spectrum license. And because one channel couldn't be shared on the same spectrum with another, each institution that wanted to do it had to have its own separate spectrum license. So it made sense for the FCC to license universities along with K-12, along with nonprofits who provide educational services generally for television. Once it's switched to the educational broadband service, you may have a little different situation. And what do I mean by that? Well, the homework gap that Commissioner Rosenworcel talks about is largely related, well, I think totally related to kindergarten through 12th grade education, not so much universities. And so if you take, I took a quick look at the EBS licenses in the 2.5 gigahertz band yesterday, and I found there are more than 20 EBS licenses that are held by an elite group of universities that all have endowments worth more than $1 billion, and in some cases, 10, 12, 13 billion dollars. Also, the vast majority of these, I think all but one or two, are leasing that spectrum for commercial purposes primarily. In fact, to give you an example of Emory, I don't want to pick on them, but Emory University has an endowment worth nearly $7 billion as of 2017, which amounts to about $450,000 of endowment money per student. So the question is, does it serve the public interest for institutions like these to hold FCC licenses when there's an ongoing homework gap in K-12 education? And just to relate that back to the question, so if you were just going to open up a license window in rural areas as the FCC has asked about in its rulemaking, and you include all incumbents, including wealthy universities, does that make sense? I think this is a good question for those who are very involved in the educational part. So maybe Zach, you can give your views, and Catherine on the question.
Sure. A couple of points. I think that the first is that there's a record in this proceeding, and there are literally hundreds of success stories that are coming from EBS licensees that lease their spectrum. They're coming from EBS licensees in rural areas who didn't wait for the commission to start to issue this spectrum that has been available for over 50 years. But hasn't been put to use, and they've built their private EBS networks. The one common thread in all of these different success stories is that today, EBS is reaching students and families that otherwise had no connectivity. We did a survey last year, and it showed that 73% of the low-income families that are using our service through a school or nonprofit organization had never had home broadband before. We lease our spectrum, and so our service is provided over a commercial network, and that means that there is commercial offers in an area everywhere that Mobile Beacon services. But it's still reaching students and families that had never had broadband before. That means that no federal program, no state program, and no other private program had reached them, but EBS is. I think that there's a misconception that just because licensees are leasing their spectrum, that means that it's not being put to use, and it's just not true. The public-private partnerships that come out of leasing your spectrum have wins for the commercial side. I mean, right now, 2.5 is the backbone of Sprint's network. It's considered the crown jewel of their upcoming 5G deployment. But it also means that programs like ours are able to connect classrooms, put Wi-Fi on school buses, create hotspot lending programs. We currently support over 920 public libraries, 850 schools, and over 4,600 nonprofits across the country. And you can do that through the leasing model. So there's no underutilization, and it's actually reaching families that had never been served before.
Yes, so I come at this from a little different angle. I like to start with first principles when I think about the underutilization of EBS. We all agree that that is the core issue here. We have a very valuable band of spectrum that is creating a ton of financial benefit both for the leasees but also for the licensees. And if I think about what the core intended purpose is in its origination for this band, I don't necessarily jump. I think there could be some interesting opportunities through this proposal that Commissioner Rosenworcel spoke about today to increase the utilization and the value of this band toward the its original educational purpose. But I think that we should also be careful not to conflate two issues, one being the need and important move toward 5G, and the other maximizing and optimizing the educational and social purpose of this band. So when I think about just to be very, very frank, I think about the first principles of what's wrong with EBS and how do we fix it to get to greater value for its public, the public benefit for which it's intended. For me, that could actually be wrapped up in a very simple proposal that would not collapse EBS, but instead create more transparency about what that value is. Today, the contracts are completely private. No one knows exactly how EBS is being valued in each contract. It has something to do with megahertz per pop. But we don't know either, unless you comb through the 990s, which I've taken some time to do, what educational benefit is being driven by the lease payments to the EBS licensees, who, by the way, were handed this public asset to steward toward this intended social purpose and educational purpose. So why not create, or at least consider and have all options on the table, opportunities to increase the transparency and the accountability on licensees to report, at least publicly, what value is being created, how to quantify that, and how it's proportionate to the value that they are receiving in terms of lease payments. I think the onus is actually on the licensees here. So to your point about whether, and your direct question around whether higher ed institutions who have licenses are using this towards this, the homework gap, I think no, but the intended purpose of this ban was not specifically for the homework gap. I think we could consider ways to increase its value on the homework gap. But I will say, having worked with and founded a nonprofit that serves all unconnected Americans, not just K-12, that there is a very big swath of low-income Americans who are first-generation college students, for whom home internet access is really important. And I'll also say that at the end of the day, without superseding the original intended purpose of this band, that if those institutions would tell us directly what value is being created towards the educational benefit, are they paying more teachers, are they creating more scholarships, we want to, as a public, we deserve to know what is the value in exchange for this public asset in the lease payments that licensees are receiving. So I would say simply that we should at least consider, we need to be careful not to conflate two issues. We need to be thorough and intentional in understanding the original intended purpose and how we better steward this asset to get there. And one solution might simply be, and we've heard from lots of licensees that this is something they'd be in favor of, a more transparent reporting and kind of public access to the value that is being created for educational purpose. So I'll stop there for now, but I can talk more.
Did any of the other panelists have any thoughts on this? And
so I'll go ahead and jump in and say, I think our organization is in an interesting position here in that some of our members utilize EBS spectrum, and some don't. It's an interesting point because a lot of our members actually, the homework gap was the very reason why they started in the first place. These were rural entrepreneurs who were frustrated by a lack of broadband in their community, and they said, my kids can't do their homework, my neighbors' kids can't do their homework, we have to fix this. And they started a company to do just that. Now, a lot of them started using unlicensed spectrum in order to provide these services, but over time, some of them have been able to acquire leases for EBS spectrum to provide higher speed, more robust service to their community. So, I think spectrum continues to be a critical infrastructure for these small rural entrepreneurs who are trying to actually be a key solver of the homework gap. And just honestly, this spectrum, particularly having these white spaces out there for commercial use, I think will do wonders for solving this. I mean, looking at the numbers internally, there will be millions, literally millions of Americans who could have access to more robust, high-speed broadband particularly if the EBS white spaces are made available for commercial use in this regard.
so I want to pick up on the point that Zach mentioned about transparency. When you think of the white spaces that, the new spectrum that's out there, and there was the back and forth discussion, and we just had it about, how do you license those? Do you let educational institutions just apply for them, or do you instead hold an auction of them? There's long been a broad consensus, over the last 20 years or so among economists, that auctioning spectrum is one of the most efficient ways to put it to the highest and best use. And one of the reasons is the transparency of the decision-making process in an auction, which is sort of an inherent feature of it. And if you allow educational institutions to apply for that white space spectrum out there, there is a question of how transparent that would be, at least under the current rules. And there's also a question of how those benefits would be distributed. Would there be enough spectrum for all the educational institutions that want it? And what about, there may be a reason so many universities ended up with television licenses back in the day, in part because they're larger and more sophisticated and have general counsels and the like, and will smaller K-12 schools even know about the opportunity to apply for it? So, then turn that into a question, and since Peter and Debbie haven't yet spoken, would educational institutions be better off under a proposal where, for the white spaces, they just apply using whatever resources they have? Or would it be better for the FCC to hold an auction and then take those funds and use them in a way that does hopefully, Commissioner Rosenworcel talked about testing, but hopefully does the most good for the most needy educational institutions, more of a need-based and transparent result. Debbie?
Well, thank you for the opportunity to talk about this. I have to be honest. CWA for over 15 years has had a program called Speed Matters. And for all this period of time, our concern has been that everybody in this country should have access to affordable high-speed broadband and have a choice about their providers. And we have looked for ways in which there can be use of public assets to generate revenue for such a program. And we've heard the statistics. I came armed with my own statistics, which I won't add to this, except to say that in addition to this being a low-income problem, it's also a problem of access by low-income people of color, African Americans and Hispanics particularly. But when we heard Commissioner Rosenworcel's idea, we really jumped. We got very excited. After all, spectrum is a public asset, and here was an opportunity to use revenues from a public asset to address a real issue in our society. And so whether the details of how this is done, I think are very important, but the concept of using revenue from a public asset to address this very important public policy issue is something we're fully behind. Instead of citing statistics, I wanted to cite an anecdote. I've read the newspaper articles about the people who sit on, the children who sit on the steps of the library to get their internet access to do their homework, who go to McDonald's. Well, I had my own personal experience last fall. There was an important election here in DC. I had a candidate I was supporting. I was outside of the Chevy Chase Community Center up in Northwest DC, distributing literature right across from the library there. And it was about 5 o'clock. And a family pulls up, mother, father, and 12-year-old daughter, run to the library, which has now closed. It was 5:15. And they were bereft. Why? When the mother was going to work at 9 in the morning, she shouted out, "What time does it close?" People thought she meant the polls. They said 7 p.m. She thought, and her question was about the library. So she had rushed home from work, gotten her daughter and her husband, and rushed to the library so her daughter could, get this, download her half-finished homework assignment because they operate in the cloud, finish it using the library's internet access, and then upload it by the due date that night so the teacher could get it. She was bereft. Well, needless to say, I stopped passing out my literature. I said, "Come to my house," and she finished her homework at my house on my computer and internet access. Nobody should have to have that choice. And so that's why we think that this is a really important idea of closing the homework gap. I want to just say one other thing about universities. We tracked very carefully what happened with the broadband BTOP program, the stimulus program. In many instances, those were education networks that took advantage of some of the infrastructure money to build duplicative, sometimes triplicative networks in areas. John, you and I have had this debate going on for 10 or 12 years, and I hear you. Well, this debate can continue, but certainly we are not interested in replicating existing networks and giving priority where there are existing commercial networks that are providing access.
Peter, do you want to
Yes.
comment?
Yes, I do. My experience with this started back in 1981. So this is not the Kennedy administration, but it does go back to Congressman Boucher and Paul Cinderbrand's times. There are clearly two goals here. One is the educational goal. And the second is the efficient use of this spectrum. And I think Commissioner Rosenworcel's idea has a lot to recommend it, because I think she's trying to come up with a way that creates a win-win opportunity here. The flexibility that's being proposed and the auction that's being proposed would both increase the value of the current licenses, which would be good for the current holders of EBS licenses, and secondly, generate auction revenues, which, if the FCC or Congress, as appropriate, determine it should be used for educational purposes, could be a more efficient, productive way to help those institutions. The second goal here, of course, is efficient use of the spectrum. And it won't be shocking to hear that Intel's primary interest here is in seeing this mid-band, incredibly valuable mid-band spectrum used as efficiently as possible. And I guess over those last almost 40 years, it's been pretty clear to me that the way to assure more efficient use is to give existing licensees flexibility, both because they then face the opportunity cost of other uses, but also, frankly, because trying to take things away from people is often unfair and comes with huge amounts of delay. So again, I think the idea here of that the Commission is proposing, and Commissioner Rosenworcel and frankly other commissioners are proposing, is give more flexibility, create contiguous licenses, assign unassigned spectrum. Claude mentioned that. It's clearly a good idea as well. Allow for aggregation, disaggregation subject to competitive review. And where appropriate, use incentive auctions. Now, I would add that I think this has to be entirely voluntary, Catherine. So, and I think Commissioner Rosenworcel has made that clear. If we don't make it voluntary, one, I think that might be unfair, and two, I don't think it'll happen. And I'm not worried about windfalls. In this case, as I indicated, they actually advance the educational purpose. And that, frankly, has been the history of this band. I remember in my early years at the Commission in the 80s, we had these debates about giving more and more flexibility. And much to my surprise, oftentimes the educational institutions didn't want that flexibility. Well, now, of course, I think it's turned out that it's been very valuable and a benefit to them, and now I sort of want to put that on steroids. Let's give them complete flexibility. Let's exhaustively assign, create an environment where this can move to high-valued two-way low-power data uses, but let's, in order to make it happen, and also probably because it's fair, make sure that the educational institutions get rewarded. And because, in fact, I think this process would create win-win opportunities, there should be an opportunity to make both sides happy. That would be the goal. I suspect that's what Commissioner Rosenworcel has in mind, but I do think logically it should be possible.
So if I could just respond to that, because I do represent an EBS licensee, and I have been very involved in the EBS community. And when the Commission did put forth this proposal, they couched it in the sense that licensees know best. They know the best way to put this spectrum to use because they've been doing it. And the Commission shouldn't decide. We should hear from them and let them decide. And if you look at the comments that have been filed in this proceeding, unanimously, EBS licensees have said, no, flexible use will unravel it. And this idea of an incentive auction just being voluntary You're forgetting that before you get to an incentive auction, you have to open up flexible use. And that's what's going to create this race to the bottom, because licensees that do want to continue to offer their programs are going to be faced with a hostile lease environment. You're not going to have partners that are willing to create these public-private partnerships with you. You're going to have operators that say, we don't want to rent spectrum anymore, we're just going to buy. It's also going to be at the cost of denying rural educators the same opportunities that their urban peers had. And we know that rural educators have plans. If you look at the comments that were filed by the state of Nebraska and the Department of Ed there, as well as the Utah Education and Telehealth Network, they've got the infrastructure in place. They said that they could put EBS spectrum to use in a matter of months, connecting every single school in their state and working to connect every single student. And that's not going to happen by just auctioning it to the commercial sector, because the commercial sector already has over 600 megahertz of other commercial spectrum in the very same areas where EBS has not been made available to rural educators. And so I think that a better way to come up with a win-win would be to let educators continue to be able to create these public-private partnerships, let them have a chance to build where they said that they're going to build and the commercial sector has not. And I think we have something like 6 other auctions that are already in the pipeline for 5G. I think we could give Commissioner Rosenworcel a homework gap subsidy fund using any of those other auctions, but not at the cost of dispensing of the educational programs that exist today and that could exist if this rural spectrum was licensed.
Just
So
two quick, can I just make 2 quick comments in the interests of constructive confrontation? Hopefully very constructive. First, Catherine, as Commissioner Rosenworcel said, 85% of the people are covered by existing licensees. All we're proposing is to give you another option. You're saying, don't give us another option.
Well, no, because the rural educators won't get an option.
Okay,
They won't
and then,
have the
and then,
opportunity
yes,
to apply.
okay, but the vast majority of people will get another option. Most of the all the current licensees will get another option. Secondly, if the money is made available, the rural people can, in fact, end up getting more than they ever would, because these licenses are not being used in rural areas for a reason right now.
Because they haven't been issued?
And lastly, if your argument had carried the day, we wouldn't have gotten the liberalization we got in 1980. So, you know, the EBS crowd has been singing this song for the last 38 years, maybe if we go back to the Kennedy years then. And every step along the way, the commission has incrementally improved the liberalization, given more choice, and I think it's been beneficial.
So let me jump in here, because we're touching on some key issues, but I think part of the role of a moderator is to frame issues, which is why I keep giving these lengthy introductions to a question. But without some framing, I think it's difficult to really understand what Peter and Catherine are talking about. And well, here's what I think they're talking about. So I'm going to frame this a little differently. When Catherine says the rural educational institutions won't have the opportunity, the question is, what is that opportunity? Now, one of those opportunities is for them to actually use the spectrum with their own networks to provide their own educational services that are unique to them in some way. And that does and has happened in the 2.5 gigahertz band. On the other hand, if you look at the FCC's licensing database, the vast majority, I did not do a percentage calculation, but I'm going to, I think, confidently estimate over 90% are leased to commercial entities, and the vast majority of the capacity is leased to commercial entities. If that's what the truth is, like, we don't need to worry whether that's exactly accurate percentage-wise, but if it overall, what that means in economic terms is that the spectrum is being used by the federal government as a subsidy to help educational institutions raise money to do things, some of which is broadband, but some of which is probably put to other programs. Now, we can argue that's a good thing. Then you get back to some of the first questions, which is, okay, but wait a second. When the government does a subsidy program, it should be transparent, as Zach said, and also efficient, right? You don't want fraud, waste, and abuse. And that's one of the auction questions. So I'm just trying to tie together what the issues are. Because one issue is, and this is what I think Peter was saying, I'm reframing it, would the rural educational institutions be better off as a whole with a subsidy program that was an incentive auction to commercial entities that raises however much, hundreds of millions, billions of dollars, and then have that available through programs that are targeted on a needs basis and the like? Or would they be better off with an implied subsidy through applications for spectrum? Now I'm going to leave moderator and make a comment. I think most economists would say implied subsidies are inefficient. But that's sort of, I think all the discussion has been around that group of issues, and I think that that's one of the things that's being debated. So I'm going to now stop with framing and ask another question, which is, and it's not directed to anyone in particular, but somewhat responsive to Catherine's point. So the current FCC proposal includes an auction of any white spaces that don't get applied for through these windows that people keep talking about. So let's say there's spectrum that nobody applies for, that would be auctioned. That indicates to me that the FCC has already contemplated doing at least some form of auction in this band. Maybe no matter what. Maybe there wouldn't be one because everything would be applied for. If that's the case, I would like a little more comment on Peter's point that if the incentive auction is voluntary, if the EBS licensees can say no, and they're still the licensees of the spectrum, and the FCC's already said auctions could be an efficient way to do this, and I don't think anyone in the EBS record is objecting to that. Can you?
Actually, I think
some are.
all of them are.
Okay.
I think to answer your other point about...
What is the downside? I want to get to the cost
Yeah.
benefits of this for the sides, if you will.
Go ahead.
I just wanted to, so from, as representing a nonprofit that's focused solely on the public, unconnected, low-income population, and in this case, we're talking about the homework gap, so the 12 million students who can't afford access for the most part or don't have the infrastructure available. The question is that we don't have a stake, we're not licensee, and we're also not interested necessarily in the commercialization of and the value that might present toward 5G deployment. We care about those people, and what is missing from this conversation is we have on one hand, a black box. We have no idea what the value being created is through EBS today. No idea, except in this piecemeal way you can try to piece together what annual reports say, and what you can find in 990s, but that doesn't look good, by the way, what you find in 990s. So I'll say that a very small percentage of the lease payments are being spent even by the biggest EBS licensees today. So you have organizations like Mobile Beacon, Mobile Citizen, HITN are the top three, some with net revenues or net assets over $50 million who are spending less than $4 million a year. That doesn't feel good as a public steward of this asset. On the other hand, we have this idea of an incentive auction, and we don't have any details yet about what that actually means around the type of value that would be created and how to compare that with this black box of value that exists today being underutilized. So as a representative of this population, I need to know what are we suggesting, how to compare the value in this potential market or this potential auction versus what could happen if we actually use the current model more efficiently and effectively toward this educational purpose, and including the homework gap. And then the last thing I'll say on that is again, I think there are some simple ways to do those comparisons. We need the information. I think leaping to an incentive auction and or allowing for the existing model to continue the way it looks today are both failing the public this is intended to serve.
Yeah, and I think that, the commission asked the question in the NPRM about, how do they deal with the outdated and legacy rules that are currently in the band? And we actually put forth a proposal to address that, because we think that there are a lot of ways that you can strengthen EBS, but it comes through modernizing the rules and increased transparency and more accountability. So a couple of ideas that we put forth are, One, you should not be talking about hours, which is what the current educational use are, 20 hours per week per channel, but actually make sure that you're tying the educational use in a way that is specific and measurable. So we actually put forth a capacity type proposal, knowing that capacity in commercial operations, they say it doubles roughly every 18 months. So making sure that you're tying an EBS minimum standard to something that you know is going to grow over time. And I think that those ongoing public disclosures are necessary. And it's not a big ask. It's something that the commission could write into its rules that doesn't cost any money, that doesn't take years to implement. And we could start that moving forward. I think that we can build more confidence around EBS that way. But what seems to be getting confused in this discussion with incentive auctions being voluntary and also talking about rural spaces, we're not talking about, they're two separate things. So the rural spectrum has not been made available. It's been just laying fallow for 50 years, and rural educators will never get an opportunity to use that to partner with WISPs or other rural operators, or to deploy and build their own networks if the FCC does not move forward with the priority windows. Incentive auctions are separate. That's for mostly urban spectrum. And we know from the EBS community, as well as every educational association that's written in, all of the states, different public interest groups like the National Digital Inclusion Alliance and Shelby, they were all unanimous saying that without educational eligibility and without stronger rules, you are going to unravel the EBS system, and it's going to be a race to the bottom that's not voluntary.
Yeah, but the goal here is to help students. And I would suggest, even though, Zach, we don't know all the ins and outs here, if the proceeds from the auction went to, as determined by Congress or the SEC, to help rural educators, that amount of money would be greater than the value to the EBS licensees. That's what Fred is alluding to about.
Even with the modernization or revision of the.
It would start to approach it, but it would approach it probably only in the sense that they would then turn around and totally lease it to somebody else and monetize it that way. Because it is likely the case that the most efficient use here is for a commercial entity to build out an integrated network that spreads the capital costs over a much bigger operation, and then provides capacity back to the educational entity. What this approach does is recognize that up front. And I think it's really, and maybe this is idealistic and not possible, but actually my approach here, I think, is remorselessly pragmatic. Give the EBS folks, current licensees, more than they currently have by giving them complete flexibility, allowing them still more opportunity to monetize, and then take the proceeds as determined by public servants, FCC or Congress, and give that to the rural educators. And if you do that, you're going to avoid a lot of the inefficiencies that come from these windows and other things that actually over the years have shown to be very inefficient compared to auctions.
Here's a couple of factual things to consider. These are just facts. Catherine mentioned Nebraska. That's my home state, and I teach at the law college there. I looked, and the University of Nebraska, my alma mater, actually holds some licenses, and I looked at their filing with the FCC as to what they're using their license for, and they're using it to do a wireless link between one building on campus and another, which is something you can do with wires or using unlicensed spectrum, frankly, that costs nothing. So, I mean, when you say they're ready to go, I asked myself, they've held these licenses for decades. That's what they're doing with it. So the FCC in its rulemaking, when they say that this has failed education, there is some ground for that. The other thing is interesting to me, a factual perspective, is the FCC did this in the broadcast television band, held an incentive auction, and the broadcasters initially opposed it. Same sort of basis, this will kill broadcasting It'll be the end of it, and it will, we're not going to participate. And then over time, they talked to investors and the like, and it turned out some ended up participating and coming out, I think, very well for themselves, and others didn't. And where's the question? I actually have a question related to that, which is, there seems to be, from the panelists, sort of an all or nothing, this will kill the but it didn't do that for broadcasters. And so the question is, couldn't there, and isn't it realistic based on what we know, be a case where there will be some educational licensees that will value this, will find out they'd be better off with an auction, and they'll participate? And there will be others, there are some of them that are using it, even still for television, making good use of it, and they'll continue to do what they're doing. It's another way of getting at the downside question. Do we really, and this is sort of to any of the other panels, do you really think this kills it? Claude?
So I think from our perspective, it doesn't. And, granted, to the point of, there's a lot of licensed spectrum out there, yeah, but our average member has 0 megahertz of licensed spectrum. So, and, we're looking at the spectrum from the perspective of this is, for a largely rural membership, and looking at all of this rural spectrum out there that can go for miles and provide a ridiculously high-speed fixed service to, families that have nothing today. And we look at sort of if you take it up a level, the prior allocation methods. Yes, some of our members have had success going to educational institutions and partnering with them and, acquiring leases for the spectrum. Others have gone, 9/10 of the way, only to be undercut at the 11th hour by a much more well-heeled commercial entity that will say, well, we'll give you more money for it, and then the local entity is kind of left in the dust. So from the perspective of transparency, I think that's why our folks are comfortable with the idea of an auction. I think the one thorny issue that we're continuing to deal with from the perspective of an auction is you have your licensee, but then in the middle you also have your lessee. So we do have some members who have existing leases. So what do you do in the case of a licensee who does raise their hand and says, I want to give up my license, and you have existing lease rights? I haven't heard a good solution to that issue yet.
I haven't either.
Could I just say one thing about that? It shouldn't be a surprise to anyone here. When I emphasize the voluntary nature of this, I'm not talking about abrogating any contracts. So that, hey, it's a great country. The licensee and the lessee can work those things out. They should. That's sufficient. That's rule of law. That doesn't have to be at odds with this proposal. If the licensee and the lessee determine on that, or if the licensee, after consulting with the lessee, says, we're not going to participate, that should be the outcome.
I guess I have questions about how an incentive auction would work, and I think, some of the facts that you might be sharing about how incentive auctions have worked before, it wasn't with spectrum that was encumbered. So I think that the average EBS lease has 18 years remaining. And so if you think about what could an incentive auction actually do in the EBS band, I think it's unrealistic to expect that it's going to raise billions of dollars or even $1 billion. So if you look at the supply and demand issues, on the supply side, you already have EBS licensees saying this is bad for education and we don't want to participate. Then you have the lease encumbrances on top of it, where you have 30 years agreements that have over 18 years left. And what about the rights of the lessee that has built and invested? Are you going to strand that investment if a licensee says, now I want to participate in this auction? And if you think about that, you would have to compensate licensees and how you would deal with all of the legal issues that have been raised by Sprint and others, like the rural operators that are concerned about having their investment just all of a sudden left stranded. And then when you think about the demand side, so the fact that there is so much consolidation in this band, if you look at the 2009 BRS incentive auction, Clearwire, which controlled most of the 2.5, was able to take the majority of that spectrum, and after only 2 rounds of bidding. So when you have just those market dynamics at place, you cannot expect an incentive auction to be successful. And it's only a one-time subsidy, and the homework gap is so big and so pervasive that we need a long-term working solution.
So,
go ahead.
Just really quickly, just due respect to both of you, I mean, this is not about the rights of the EBS licensees, and it's not about the rights of the lessees of those EBS licensees. This is a public asset given to nonprofits to steward toward the intended educational purpose of the band. And so ultimately, as like at the end of the day, if it's not working now, let's fix it. And if an auction is the best way to fix it, prove it, as compared to the way it might work in an ideal future state within the current model. And those two things don't seem to be bubbling up. Like, I want to be clear that there's a third way. We want to be reasonable in comparing options and choosing what's best for those this is intended to serve. You know, we could really care less about the rights of the licensees or the lessees.
One of the problems that, as Zach alluded to this further, is, I mean, I think all the questions Catherine raises are good questions. One of the problems is we don't know the answers to those questions because there isn't transparency around what the lease terms are. So on the one hand, they're good questions. On the other hand, I don't think you can conclude from the questions, and I'm leaving moderator and giving you opinion, that it wouldn't work. There is one lease that a K-12 school published, even though it has confidentiality provisions. Then it was removed again, but I think they had, because they're a government entity, right? They had transparency requirements, so they put it on their website, and I downloaded it during that window some years ago that had the lease terms on it. And over the 30-year term of the lease, I calculated it was going to be about the cost of the spectrum for 30 years was 7 cents a megahertz pop. And then you compare that to what I think is a comparable situation, and economists would argue about this. Take this with a grain of salt, right? But AWS-1, where you had a similarly large swath of spectrum, which affects prices, a similar transition. At that point, it was the first big band for 3G, and here you're looking at, a mid band for 5G. Very similar propagation characteristics in the 2 gigahertz band. That spectrum averages over 50 cents a megahertz pop. And for those who don't know what a megahertz pop is, don't worry about the details. It's a valuation that I'll reduce to this: 7 cents versus 50 cents, or 51 on average. 6-7 times the value, right? So I don't know, but one option, if you're a lessee and you have a private deal with a lessor and you've valued the deal at 7 cents and an auction might put it at 51 cents, and this can't be taken advantage of because of a lease that has 18 years, those two parties may get together and say, let's split the revenue difference. I'll walk away with more money if I'm the person leasing, because I'm assuming if you take into account your opportunity cost of not using the spectrum, blah, blah, blah. And the educational institution will say, I'm going to put this into my endowment and I'll make 7% a year. I'm going to be better off. All those things are possible. I don't think anybody here knows enough, because it's not about how much of that would occur or whether, but I would foreclose those possibilities. You don't have to aggregate leases. The secondary market can figure out things to do here if there's an opportunity. And what the incentive auction did for the broadcasters, it provided a clearinghouse, provided an impetus. It reduced these secondary market transaction costs. But I want to leave that alone. Not a very good moderator. There is something that the Commissioner Rosenworcel said that I think is very important, and I frankly hadn't, when I think of money from the FCC for education, I think in terms of that E-rate program, the USF program, where there are, you build fiber to the school. And she pointed out her homework gap problem is really broader. And that problem includes, how do you get broadband to the students at home? Well, there's something I don't think she raised directly, and we haven't talked about yet, which is, if that's the problem, doesn't it start to bleed into, and she did mention Lifeline, the problem of affordability for families at home, and also, in rural areas particularly, the problem of the availability or access to a network capable of supporting broadband speeds. And so then my question becomes, when you look at this rural question of would we be better off auctioning it to commercial entities and then using that money for things like Lifeline or not, would it make sense for the FCC and USF study areas to, for instance, provide a discount in the auction for rural carriers and WIFs and the like who are willing to use it to do a fixed broadband USF solution, which seems like, could that kill two birds with one stone? And Roger, the obvious. I mean, what are some thoughts around the ways, yes, I think it'd be used for 5G in urban areas. It's not clear that you couldn't also do fixed and rural, and how might that play into both the homework gap and the general rural-urban or digital divide?
Right. I think that's a great question, and that's right at the intersection of what our members are doing and want to do more of. As I mentioned at the beginning, that's the homework gap issue is the reason why a lot of our folks got started in the first place. And using this spectrum, which has this long educational history that the commissioner so eloquently talked about, to be able to provide, robust broadband service so these students can do their homework, it seems like a fantastic solution. And to Fred's point, I think we've been very much supportive of more robust build-out obligations, more robust service obligations using this spectrum, and providing some sort of small entity or rural service bidding credit to incentivize the private market to be able to reach more and do more, I think is something that our folks would be incredibly supportive of. I think sort of the one thing that we haven't really discussed that I think would also be kind of critical for robust entrepreneurial access to this spectrum is to ensure that if we do go to auction, that more than one party is able to play in the spectrum, and so it's not all gobbled up by one large entity that has access to Wall Street backing, so that our folks who can barely get loans and grants from Main Street would be able to have an opportunity to access this spectrum. And we're open to all sorts of suggestions on how to best accomplish that, but I think that's something that is critical going forward.
Debbie, I know this is a core issue to you, access to broadband generally. What do you think the potential in rural areas is for Universal Service Fund generally? Just even beyond, is there a synergy with the education aspect?
Well, I think in the rural areas, we still see that there are huge access problems, that the infrastructure is not there, that the economics are not there, and that there has to be some kind of public support in order to make the economics work. I want to add one piece that has not been part of this discussion, whichever direction we go. And this has been a concern of our union, which is when these public support programs are initiated, which we think are in general positive, unfortunately, sometimes they serve to lower the labor standards of the people who work in the industry. And so we are putting together proposals that would say that any program, whether it is the use of a public asset like spectrum, whether it is a CAF subsidy, whether it is a direct grant, should also have labor standards as part of the program, so that the living standards of those people who build the networks, who support the networks, who maintain the networks, who service the networks, are not degraded because those who bid to do the work are going to be undercutting those labor standards with either temporary work, sending the work for the servicing offshore, et cetera. So I want to add that concept to this. And since it's a federal program, we don't have to get into issues of preemption of our labor laws, but that we need to ensure that people have the opportunity who work in this industry to have collective bargaining so that we maintain good, skilled career employees who are able to earn a family supporting wage and benefits.
I want to make sure we have time for some questions, and I think we have plenty of time, but I'm going to then give each panelist now, that was a good point, something we hadn't raised, to just say something, make their last, no more than a minute or so. What point have we not talked about you think is important? And we'll start with Peter. Anything? And if you don't have anything, that's fine too.
Well, I'll just say, again, two goals here: education, efficient use of the spectrum. A new point on the education goal. One of the things we've learned over the last, or at least I have, hopefully rightly, learned is that subsidies are done better if they're efficiently funded and targeted to a use. And if, in fact, and so again, the benefit of taking auction revenues and then targeting it to the interest that the public policy makers decide strikes me as efficient. I would just note that one of the things the FCC could do here, and it was mentioned, I think maybe by Zach or Claude, is the deployment milestones. That actually can be an efficient way here because, in effect, it's publicly funded because the auction revenues are lower by the cost of the deployment requirement, right? And if they're awarded through an auction process, then you're not skewing competition and so on. So I think that's an important point. As for the larger use, I don't think I have anything new to say other than that this is not cold fusion. If you look at the history of spectrum policy over the last 40 years, flexibility, exhaustive assignment, aggregation, disaggregation, auctions, reduced transaction costs, those end up benefiting the larger public interest far and away.
Catherine, you got anything you think we've overlooked?
Yeah, I guess I would sum it up by saying that the homework gap and any problem like the digital divide that is as big and pervasive as it is, we need policy that supports multiple approaches to fixing it. We can't deny that the free market has left rural Americans stranded. We can't deny the fact that in both rural parts of the country and low-income neighborhoods and urban parts of the country, we have our two largest providers that are charging the same amount for slow, outdated technology that they are for high-speed fiber connections in wealthy areas. That's because there is no competition there. And simply continuing to just make spectrum available only for commercial use isn't going to fix it. We do need to think bigger, but we need to have policy that supports the fact that different kinds of organizations have important roles to play in solving this problem, and that the 12 million students that are in the homework gap today shouldn't have to wait years for an auction to take place and then proceeds to trickle down when we have a path that is going to put the spectrum to work through anchor institutions today and in the short term. And we don't think that the Commission should give up on one of the tools that can complement existing federal programs like Lifeline and E-rate, which won't provide connectivity for home broadband use.
Zach?
Yeah, I'll just say, again, I think the burden of proof here is both on the EBS licensees and on the Commission, if this proposal moves forward, to show that there is greater and increased value in utilization of this band toward its intended purpose. And one idea is, as we talk about the homework gap, that maybe seems so simple that it's silly, beyond just straight transparency, to create a pull mechanism for how EBS licensees are using this and how the lessees are engaged with EBS licensees. We have a 12 million student digital divide. Why not make the cost-free lines that are built into most of the contracts work directly toward that end and mandate it? Why not show? And by the way, I'm fully open to the idea of an auction being more valuable toward this purpose as well. But right now, where we sit trying to serve this population as an American public, it is not clear that either of these are going to get us where we need to go and are the most efficient and effective use of the band towards its intended purpose for educational and social purpose. That's the bottom line for us, and I think that the burden of proof is both on the Commission and the licensees.
Tabby?
Commissioner Rosenworcel, thank you for opening up this conversation. And I hope that we don't limit it only to talking about this particular band, but that we be looking, and if we need to, going to Congress as well, so that all spectrum auctions have a dedicated portion that is dedicated toward closing the digital divide and the homework gap.
Claude.
I would echo Debbie's thanks. This has been a fantastic conversation, and I think my overarching point is that a lot of the conversation around spectrum tends to focus on the largest mobile wireless providers, and we need to take into account providers that are already in rural America, who are already providing service and want to do so more robustly and more broadly, and that our spectrum conversations need to take those needs into account as well.
Okay, so we can open it up to the audience, and we'll use the same process the Congressman used. Raise your hand, and someone will come around with a mic. And you can ask a question on the microphone to any of the panelists or all. See some hands up.
Hi, my name's Paul Marconi. I represent several educational institutions. Correct me if I'm wrong, but any voluntary auction that raises revenue, if the FCC has the authority currently to go ahead with an auction without any act of Congress, but they went ahead with an auction without Congress acting to define where those revenues would go, then currently those revenues would go right back to the Treasury on the federal side. So wouldn't it make more sense to not hold a voluntary auction until and if Congress passes legislation not only mandating that there be the option that current licensees have to have an auction, but also defining where the revenues would go, what particular programs they would go to, whether that's to provide Wi-Fi on buses or to provide hotspots to students in areas that are underserved. So I just would throw it out to the panel that wouldn't it make more sense to say no auction until Congress acts and legislation is actually signed into law, so we have a guarantee that any revenues generated by an auction would actually go to benefit education and not simply go back to the Treasury.
I'll say something. First off, I think it would be important for the Commission to determine what it thinks it could do under rulemaking authority. We talked about a few ideas here. Deployment in rural areas as an obligation, which in effect do get funded by the auction, as I was explaining. You, I'm sure, get the intuition of that, because if something you're buying has an obligation, you're willing to pay less for it. Well, if those those constraints or encumbrances could adequately deal with the educational needs here, then you wouldn't need to do that. Otherwise, though, you make a very good point. I would just say one final thing, which is, fortunately, spectrum is one of those rare areas that has been more or less bipartisan. And so hopefully win-win type propositions might be well received.
I would just say yes. If legislation is required to make a homework gap fund available, then we need to know that that is possible before we auction, for sure.
And I think that's another reason why, again, I would support the other auctions that are already in the pipeline, using the proceeds of that to be able to fund the homework gap. But the issue here is, again, one of timeliness, the fact that through priority windows, you could get this into the hands of rural operators through partnerships with EBS licensees, and EBS licensees that have said that they're ready to self-deploy. And I think that, again, we need to have multiple paths to solving the homework gap, multiple approaches, and they should not all be waiting several years to go into place.
Other questions? See a couple on the left, well, your right side of the room.
Hi, this is Jane Lee with Public Knowledge again. So I want to focus back on the effect to the end user in rural communities. So my understanding is with the successful EBS licensees right now, people are able to get internet access for about $10. So if there was an incentive auction, the reality is a lot of the large carriers would get the licenses. And so would they be like, how can we guarantee that they provide internet access for low costs like that?
Let me just, one clarification, I'll let others answer. What you're talking about, the $10 per month offer that some EBS licensees make available, is actually the exception. Most EBS licensees don't make a low-cost broadband offer available. But the other thing to note is that when they do, those are actually cost-free lines. The $10 per month is directly back to the licensee for operating costs, et cetera. And there are some licensees who actually make it completely free. I think part of what I was saying before is why not make it a mandated part of every contract that cost-free lines quantified to be proportionate to to each license and its value be part of each contract.
Yeah, and I think Shelby actually proposed that in their comments as a way to update and modernize the rules, and I think that there is value in that, so that, again, you're able to demonstrate and show, and there is consistency across the board. I mean, we have, and I have a couple of examples here too from our users that have written in, and they're all saying the same thing over and over again, that without the EBS service that they rely on today, they would not be able to serve their communities, and they would not, what was left over in terms of low-cost offers are just simply not available. And I think some of the issues that I have with a homework gap or mobile hotspot subsidy is that you're not, one, if you're paying for the cost of the device, who's providing the service? And how much data are they going to be given? And what happens when that device is lost or stolen or becomes obsolete in 2 years? That's why, again, I think we need to be making sure that the commission is using this spectrum to be able to have a long-term solution that is going to continue to benefit communities and their residents.
But to be clear, it's not enough that's happening right now. The licensees aren't providing enough value towards digital inclusion. It's just, you can't argue that it's proportionate to the value being created through the lease payments.
So I would say it may seem counterintuitive, but a requirement like that on the license would ensure that only the largest players would be able to compete for those licenses. And what I mean by that is if this is, you have to be big enough to internally cross-subsidize that requirement. So if you're talking about a small rural operator, some of whom are so new that they haven't even taken a paycheck for themselves from their business, they're not going to be able to go out and say, well, I'm going to buy a license and then provide free service if they're a low margin operation already. So I would just say think carefully about that.
I think I've gone well over time, so we're going to wrap this up. I want to thank all the panelists. I want to thank the Internet Innovation Alliance and Commissioner Rosenworcel for her time, the Congressman. I think it was a great event. Hopefully we all learned a lot and got different perspectives that could be helpful down the road. So thank you, panelists, and thank you, everyone who attended.